This video has been produced to support community engagement about the rate options study for Snowy Valleys Council. It's part of a series of videos as shown on your screen, and I'd encourage you to start with the introduction video as this provides the background and context for what I'll go through specifically in relation to rural residential land in this video. As a starting point, I'll look at the current rating structure that's in place for rural residential land in each of the former councils. It's important to note that under the Local Government Act, councils must have distinct rating categories for farmland, business and residential land, but rural residential is an optional subcategory within the residential category. Councils don't have to define it separately, and as I'll discuss later, the former Chairman Shire didn't use it until 2005 when it was introducing a special rate variation. And so when we're considering the current rating structure of rural residential land, it's worth comparing this to the rating of ordinary residential land too. So starting in Tumut, the $540 minimum rate applies as it does to all of the categories, and then above the threshold, about $72,000, there's an ad valorem rate or rate in the dollar that applies, so rates are increasing with the value of the land. And if we overlay the residential rating structure, we can see that the rates paid are quite a bit higher on the same value property. And in the former Tumbarumba Shire, there's a 40% base rate that everyone pays, and then an ad valorem rate that goes up with the value of land over and above this. And if we overlay the residential rating structure, we can see that particularly up the higher end of property values, the rates are considerably higher on residential properties than on the same value rural residential property. And if we now compare all of these different rating structures, we can see that it's the residential ratepayers in the former Tumut Shire that are paying by far the highest rates, and the rural residential ratepayers in the former Tumbarumba Shire that are paying by far the lowest rates. It's important to understand the history behind the establishment of the rural residential subcategory in each of the former councils because it is quite different. So starting in Tumbarumba, the rural residential subcategory was used as subcategories are used in most councils to even out the rates paid on the lower value residential land and the higher valued rural residential land. So even though the typical rural residential property is worth 2.5 times that of the typical residential property, the rates paid on the rural residential is only 1.5 times as much. This was possible though because there was a reasonably clear distinction between the lower value residential and the higher value rural residential. In the former Tumut Shire, there's a significant overlap between the two, as can be seen in this chart. And when both of these charts are combined, it's clear that there is a significant overlap for Snowy Valleys between the value of residential and rural residential land. So if we draw a line at, say, $86,000, which is the value of the typical rural residential block in Tumbarumba, there's actually almost 1,000 residential properties valued over that amount in Snowy Valleys. But there's less than half of that number of rural residential properties over 86,000. So the question then is it fair for these higher value rural residential properties to be paying around 20% less in rates on land of the same value? The trouble is, addressing this does result in some considerable increases for the rural residential ratepayers. The history of the rural residential subcategory in the former Tumut Shire is quite different. Up until a special rate variation was introduced in 2005, there was no rural residential subcategory. Everyone was in residential. The then council introduced a special rate variation on the basis that no one would pay more and offset the increases associated with the SRV with lower water and sewer charges. So the rural residential subcategory was simply those residential properties not connected to water and sewer and so not benefiting from the reduction in water and sewer charges. While this approach was in some respects understandable, it was a red herring. The ordinary rates are not related to the water and sewer charges. Councils need to run these two operations as distinct businesses and generate the revenues from these areas to pay for these services. The reality is that the rural residential ratepayers in the former Tumut Shire have paid 36% lower rates for the last 15 years. when the special rate variation was introduced, the only ones that paid more were the residential properties and the business properties. Another complication of this history is that almost half of the properties that are currently classified as rural residential are non-compliant with the requirements of the Act, which says that they can only be classified as rural residential if they are larger than 2 hectares. So when this special rate variation expires, they need to return to the residential land use category anyway. And because rates on residential land are higher, this will result in an increase in rates for these former rural residential ratepayers and a slight decrease for the rest of the residential ratepayers. So considering the history behind the rural residential subcategory in each of the former councils and the difficulties in applying a fair rating structure across Snowy Valleys as a whole, the option of eliminating the subcategory is something that needs to be considered as part of this process. But the key issue with this is the size of the increases felt by individual rural residential ratepayers. The impacts associated with the two options included in the community survey are explained following. But before we consider this, it's important to address what is no doubt a reasonable concern in relation to the fairness of any proposal to treat residential and rural residential land the same for rating purposes. The issue relates to the fact that rural residential ratepayers will possibly feel that they receive lower service levels than those in ordinary residential areas. There is no curb and gutter or footpaths, for example, and other facilities like pools, parks and sporting grounds are further away and so harder to access. In the rate options study, I've analysed the net cost of all these council services and allocated these to each of the main land use categories on a proportional basis. I'd encourage you to have a look at the study if you want to know more, but I'm afraid there is too much detail to go through the analysis here. All I can do is provide the outcomes of the analysis. And what I've found, based on the assumptions stated in the study, was that rural residential ratepayers get about $1.40 in services back for each dollar of rates they put in, which is more than any of the other rating categories, although close to residential. And when we consider this alongside the tax rate on the land, shown in purple bars here, which I've calculated by dividing the rates paid by the land values, we can see that the rural residential ratepayers are actually taxed at a considerably lower rate than ordinary residential ratepayers, which is what we saw before with the current rating structure. And bearing this in mind, there is an argument to reduce that gap. So now we need to look at the options Council has included in the survey regarding the new rating structure for Snowy Valleys Council. Basically, there's two options that either involve eliminating the rural residential subcategory and treating all residential land the same, or retaining the rural residential subcategory with a 50% base rate. To explain the impact of the options on different ratepayers, I'll be using this chart. So at the top, we've got the rating structure that's in place for rural residential in each of the former councils, with rates going up based on the value of the land. And at the bottom, it shows the number of rating assessments for each of those property values. So you can see there's a pretty consistent distribution in terms of the number of properties of different values in each of the former councils, with Chermit in blue and Tumbarumba in red. The purple line that I've added at the top shows the rates that would be payable under option A, which is eliminating the subcategory, and you can see that that purple line is above both the blue and the red lines, indicating that the rates would go up for most ratepayers at different property values. The blue line that I've added at the bottom there shows the increases in percentage terms for properties of different values in Chermit. And what it's showing is that with the reduction in rates at the lower end of property values in Chermit, with the elimination of the minimum rate, rates are decreasing in percentage terms for those landowners. In the middle range of property values in Chermit, around the $60,000 mark, there's some considerable increases of around 35%, but it's important to remember that's about the premium that the residential ratepayers in Chermit have been paying for the last 15 years compared to rural residential. Then at the higher end of property values in Chermit, you can see that the increases are coming down to virtually nothing, around the $150,000 mark and above. And that's related to the introduction of the base rate, which flattens out the rating structure, reducing the difference between low and high value properties. The red line that I've added shows the impacts in percentage terms on ratepayers in Tumbarumba, and you can see, because the line's flat, that The increases are fairly consistent on all property values in percentage terms, but it is a significant increase across all property values of around 30%. It's important to recognise, though, that the increases in dollar terms are quite different. At the lower end, the increases are around $100, but at the higher end, the increases are approaching 3 times this amount. And it's important to note too that the increases at the lower end would still put the rates below the $540 minimum that's currently paid in Tumut on properties of similar value now. The second option that's considered in the survey is retaining the existing rural residential subcategory and including a 40% base rate that's in place in Tumbarumba at the moment. And as can be seen, the blue line showing the impact on ratepayers in Tumut, the increases are far less than under option A. The biggest increases are around the $60,000 to $70,000 mark, and they're about 20% rather than 36% for option A. And also in Tumbarumba, the increases in percentage terms are now under 20% for most ratepayers. This video is focused on the impacts of the two options on rural residential ratepayers, but it's also important before we finish up to clarify the impacts of these options on ordinary residential ratepayers. This chart shows the rates payable on residential land of different values, both in the case where the rural residential subcategory is retained and where it's eliminated. And the lines are very close together, which shows that there's very little difference in the rates paid. But if we take a property of median value around $60,000, the elimination of rural residential saves about $10 a year, or about 1.5% of rates. And at the lower end, it drops off to very little, and at the top end at most, the saving is around 3% per year for the residential ratepayers. So in summary, here's the two options side by side. Option A involves eliminating the rural residential subcategory and results in significant increases for ratepayers in Tumbarumba and for many in Tumut too. Option B retains the subcategory, and so the increases are far less, but this does mean that rural residential ratepayers end up paying 15 to 25% less in rates than ordinary residential ratepayers do on land of the same value, despite the fact that the cost of services that council provides and the ability to pay is about the same. One thing that's important to note in relation to these increases is that the rate options study has recommended that council explore opportunities to limit increases in rates to no more than 10% per annum. So thanks for taking the time to hear some more about the rate options for rural residential land in Snowy Valleys Council. Again, I'd encourage you to complete the survey and to check out the other information that's available at the link shown on your screen.